11 years is a long time to hold your breath. That was how Ellis Cole described the voyage of the Marrow, humanity's first ship to cross the dead ocean between galaxies. 11 years of recycled air, rationed dreams, and a crew that had trained itself to sleep with one eye open even in the deepest cold sleep cycles. And now, in the final hour before translation into a galaxy that had never once heard a human voice, nobody on the bridge was breathing at all. "Contact in 3 minutes," said the navigation officer, her voice thin against the hum of the engines. "Compact border relay confirms our approach vector. They're expecting us." Captain Nora Voss stood at the center of the bridge like a woman carved from old iron. She had fought in the ration wars as a child, watched her mother's name crossed off a ledger fed, and grown into a soldier who trusted silence the way other people trusted friends, which is to say, not at all. She did not smile when the readouts confirmed a peaceful, thriving civilization on the other side of the jump. She simply nodded, the way she nodded before every battle she'd ever survived. "Take us in," she said. The Marrow broke into real space inside a galaxy humanity had only ever seen as a smear of light through century-old telescopes. What greeted them stole the breath from everyone still trying to hold it in. Ships, thousands of them, cities of light suspended in the dark, spinning slow and unhurried, built by hands that had never known what it meant to hide. This was a compact, an alliance of over 1,000 species that had not fought a major war in more than 11,000 years. To the crew of the Marrow, it did not look like a civilization. It looked like a fantasy someone had forgotten to defend. And that, more than anything, terrified them. The compact's flagship, the Verdant Accord, sent only one envoy aboard the Marrow, unarmed, unarmored, walking into the heart of a warship without so much as a raised hand for protection. Senator Oro was tall, pale gold, with eyes that shifted color like weather moving across a hillside. Ellis had studied 1,000 pages of xenolinguistic theory to prepare for this moment, and none of it had prepared him for how gentle the alien's voice sounded. "You have traveled farther than any species in recorded memory," Oro said, translator threading warmth into words that should have felt clinical. "The compact welcomes you not as strangers, but as family not yet met." Voss did not lower her hand from the sidearm at her hip, not because she distrusted Oro exactly, but because 11 years of training had taught her crew that hands only relaxed after threats were confirmed dead, not before. When Oro reached out, a customary compact greeting, palm to shoulder, meant to convey trust, 3 Marines drew weapons before their brains caught up with their instincts. Oro did not flinch. Oro simply waited, patient as stone, while the humans lowered their guns 1 trembling inch at a time. "Forgive them," Voss said quietly. "We are not used to open hands." Oro tilted its head, curious rather than afraid. "Then, perhaps," it said, "we have much to learn from each other." For 3 days, the Marrow orbited in a state the crew hadn't experienced in living memory. Calm. Compact vessel performed no drills, ran no war games, kept no sentries. Ellis walked the halls of the Verdant Accord, documenting a species that had built an entire civilization on the assumption that tomorrow would not try to kill them. But Ellis noticed something else too, something the diplomats missed, buried in the footnotes of compact protocol, a tradition called the Aurelian Presentation, a ceremonial formation of warship performed for every newly discovered civilization, meant to demonstrate the totality of the compact's strength not as threat, but as promise, a show of unity, a gift, in their eyes, freely given. It is meant to say, "We could destroy you, and instead we choose peace," Oro explained when Ellis asked about the strange training exercise being prepared in the outer system. "Every species we have welcomed has understood this. It is the oldest ceremony we have." Ellis felt something cold pool in his stomach, though he couldn't yet name why. "How is it performed?" he asked. "In silence," Oro said, smiling in the way it had learned humans smiled. "Silence is sacred to us. It says, 'Watch, and know we mean you no harm.'" Ellis did not sleep that night. Somewhere in his mind, a memory surfaced unbidden. His grandmother's stories of the second collapse, when silent fleets had appeared on the horizon of a dying Earth, and by the time anyone understood their intentions, entire cities were already gone. Silence, to humans, had never once meant safety. On the 4th day, Captain Voss received the ceremonial notice through official channels, At dawn ship time, the compact had performed the Aurelian presentation, a formation of 41 vessels, arriving in complete radio silence, weapon systems visibly active as tradition demanded, encircling the Marrow in a display meant to honor humanity's arrival. Ellis tried to explain it to Voss exactly as Oro had explained it to him. He tried to make her understand that silence here was reverence and not threat. But he watched her face as he spoke, and he saw a woman doing arithmetic she had done 1,000 times before in the war rooms of dying Earth. Unknown fleet, radio silence, weapons active, closing formation. Nora, Ellis said, using her first name for the first time in 11 years. This isn't what it looks like. I promise you, this isn't what it looks like. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the tactical display, where 41 alien warships were already beginning to move into position around her ship, silent, patient, weapons glowing exactly the way weapons glowed in the last transmission her mother had ever sent her. Ellis, she said quietly, in my experience, it always looks like this right before it happens. Outside the viewport, the first compact ship began to move into formation. The countdown had already begun, and no one on the Marrow yet understood that 6 minutes of silence were about to become the most catastrophic misunderstanding in the history of two galaxies. 6 minutes. That was all it would take to end 41 lives, shatter a fragile peace 11 years in the making, and prove to an entire galaxy that the stories they had heard about humanity's arrival were true in the worst possible way. 6 minutes, and Captain Nora Voss would spend every second of the rest of her life reliving them. The bridge of the Marrow had gone silent in the way only trained soldiers could manage. No panic, no shouting, just a low murmur of stations calling out numbers that all meant the same terrible thing. 41 contacts. Closing formation. Weapons hot. No communication. They're not hailing us, said the tactical officer, a young man named Reyes who had lost both parents in the third ration riots and had never once in his life seen an unarmed ship approach without warning first. Captain, why aren't they hailing us? Ellis was already moving, already shouting into the comms channel Oro had given him. Try to raise the verdant accord, try and explain that this was ceremony, this was tradition, this was a gift and not a blade. But 11 years of translation lag and unfamiliar frequencies meant his voice arrived exactly 4 seconds too late for anyone to hear it in time. The compact ships moved with the unhurried grace of civilization that had never learned to fear its own military. To them, this was theater, beautiful, solemn, sacred. 41 ships arranging themselves into the shape of an open hand. Weapons illuminated not to threaten, but to prove restraint. Silence held not as a weapon but as a vow. To the Marrow, it looked like a noose closing. Captain, formation complete, Reyes said, voice cracking. They have firing solutions on every section of our hull. This, too, was tradition, a final gesture in the Aurelian presentation, meant to say we could end you, and instead we offer you our hand. No compact species had ever misread it in 11,000 years of first contacts. No compact species had ever needed to. But no compact species had ever survived what humanity had survived either. Voss's mind was no longer on the bridge. It was on Earth in the final days of the second collapse, watching a silent fleet arrange itself above her home, exactly like this. Patient, wordless, absolute. In the 6 minutes before it opened fire on everything she had ever loved. She had been 11 years old. She had watched her mother's ship become a screen full of static. She had sworn, in the wreckage of that day, that she would never again wait to find out what silence meant. Ellis, she said, and her voice did not shake. Talk to me. Now. They mean no harm. I swear to you I've read the... That's not an answer. There's a particular kind of math that soldiers learn in wars they did not choose, a calculation that trades a possibility of being wrong for certainty of surviving long enough to find out. Voss had run this calculation 100 times in the ration lines of her childhood, in the trenches of the series campaign, in every silence that had ever preceded catastrophe. She ran it now, in less than 4 seconds, with 41 ships holding firing solutions on her only home in this galaxy. Ellis, she said, if you're wrong, we die not knowing why. If I'm wrong, 41 ships die for nothing. Tell me which mistake you can live with. Ellis had no answer. There wasn't time to give one. Oro's voice finally crackled through the comm. For seconds too late, warm and proud and utterly unaware of the horror unfolding. Captain Voss, the compact honors you with the Aurelian presentation. Please, hold your position and witness. The transmission arrived at the exact moment the lead compact vessel's weapons array pulsed brighter. The ceremonial final flourish, the moment in the ritual meant to represent the fullness of restrained power. To Voss, it was a muzzle flash before the shot. Weapons free, she said. All batteries, engage. Reyes's hands moved before his conscience could catch them. 11 years of training had built a soldier who obeyed faster than she could doubt. The first human weapon fired into the silence of a galaxy that had forgotten what war sounded like. It took the Marrow 93 seconds to destroy what an alliance of 1,000 species had spent millennia building trust to prevent. Compact vessels, unshielded for ceremony, weapons live only for display, never once expecting violence, fell in the dark like paper lanterns caught in a storm. There was no return fire. There was no chance for return fire. The Aurelian presentation had no defensive posture, because in 11,000 years, none had ever been needed. Ellis screamed into the calm for a ceasefire that came 4 seconds too late for 11 of the 41 ships, and not at all for the other 30. When the guns finally fell silent, truly silent, the human kind of silence, the kind that comes after and not before, the bridge of the Marrow stared out at a field of wreckage lit by dying engine cores, and Ellis understood, with a horror that would never fully leave him, that Oro's warm, proud voice was still open on the comm channel, still recording, still capturing the exact moment the compact learned what humanity truly was. Captain Voss stood motionless at the center of the bridge, her hand still resting on the console, and for the first time in 11 years, she did not know whether she'd just saved her crew or ended a piece that could never be rebuilt. Somewhere in the wreckage, a single compact lifeboat drifted free of the debris field, carrying the only survivor of ceremony that cost 41 ships their lives, and carrying with it the truth that no one aboard the Marrow was yet ready to hear. The silence had never been an attack. It had only ever been a gift. There is a particular silence that follows a massacre, one that Ellis Cole had never encountered before and hoped never to encounter again. Not the sacred silence of compact ceremony, not the tactical silence of a warship's bridge, but the silence of a galaxy trying to decide whether it had just welcomed a monster into its home. For 6 days after the destruction of the Aurelian fleet, no compact vessel approached the Marrow. No hail came, no demand for surrender, no fleet of retaliation, nothing at all. Just a terrible patience of civilization that had not fought a war in 11,000 years, deciding, carefully and without haste, what to do with a species that had ended 41 lives in 93 seconds. Voss did not sleep. She stood her watches in silence, staring at wreckage that compact recovery vessels moved through with a reverence that felt, to the human crew, unbearably like grief made visible. Ellis watched alien engineers pull bodies from the debris field with their bare, gloveless hands, weeping in a language his translator couldn't yet render into anything but raw sound. He understood, watching them, that the compact had never buried its dead in a hurry. They had never needed to learn how. When the summons finally came, it did not arrive as an ultimatum. It arrived as an invitation, worded with the same maddening gentleness Oro had used on the first day, requesting that representatives of the Marrow appear before the compact assembly to explain what had happened and why. They're not demanding a surrender, Ellis told Voss, disbelief threading through his exhaustion. They're asking us to explain ourselves. That's it. That's the whole message. Voss did not trust it. 11 years of survival had taught her that mercy without conditions was simply violence with better manners, a trap dressed up as patience. She prepared her crew for execution disguised as diplomacy, for a compact fleet waiting beyond the horizon to finish what the Aurelian ships could not. What she found instead, standing before the vast amphitheater of the compact assembly, 1,000 species arranged in concentric rings of grief and fury and desperate confusion, was a civilization that genuinely did not understand how peace had turned to slaughter in 93 seconds, and needed, more than it needed revenge, to know why. Senator Oro stood at the center of the chamber, and for the first time since Ellis had met it, its shifting eyes had gone the color of storm-gray stone. 41 crews, Oro said, voice carried without amplification through a chamber built for truth rather than theater. Explain to us what we did to earn this. Voss opened her mouth to answer with the language of tactics. firing solutions, formation patterns, the cold vocabulary of a soldier defending a decision she still believed had been necessary. Ellis stopped her with a hand on her arm, the same gesture that had gotten 3 Marines to draw their weapons on their first day in this galaxy. And this time nobody reached for anything at all. "Let me," he said quietly. "They don't need a tactical debrief. They need to understand what we are." He stepped into the center of the chamber alone, a single human standing before 1,000 species who had just watched his people commit what looked, from every angle available to them, like an unprovoked massacre. He had spent 11 years preparing speeches for First Contact. None of them had prepared him for this. "You asked what you did to earn this," Ellis said, and his voice did not carry the confidence of rehearsal. It carried something raw, something that made even the angriest delegates lean forward to listen. "The answer is nothing. You did nothing, and that is the entire tragedy of what happened here." A murmur moved through the assembly, not of forgiveness, but a confusion sharp enough to demand more. "You have not fought a war in 11,000 years, Ellis continued. "You build a civilization on the assumption that silence means safety. We build ours on the opposite assumption, because every time silence fell over our history, it was followed by something none of us survived unchanged." Oro raised a hand, and the chamber fell into the kind of silence that no longer felt threatening to Ellis. It felt like the silence of people trying, against their grief, to actually listen. "Then tell us," Oro said, and something in its storm-gray eyes had softened into something closer to sorrow than fury. "Tell us what shaped a species capable of this. Tell us the truth, Ellis Cole, and we will decide together what justice looks like." Ellis looked back at Voss, standing rigid at the edge of the chamber, her hand still resting near her hip out of 11 years of habit she could not yet unlearn. He thought of his grandmother's ration book, its pages full of names crossed out in shaking handwriting. He thought of the second collapse, of silent fleets, of a species that clawed its way back from 3 separate extinctions and called a scar tissue civilization. "It will not be a short story," he said quietly. "We have 11,000 years of patience," Oro answered. "We can spare the time to understand 1,100 years of your survival." And so, standing alone in a chamber built for 1,000 species who had never known what it meant to almost not exist, Ellis Cole began to tell him the truth about humanity. Not the triumphant truth of exploration and discovery, but the harder truth underneath it, that the Marrow had not arrived as conquerors, but as survivors of history so violent it had taught an entire species to flinch first and grieve later. He did not know yet whether the truth would save his people or condemn them. He only knew that for the first time since the massacre, someone in this galaxy was finally willing to ask why instead of simply demanding how much. Some truths cannot be told in a single sitting. Ellis Cole learned this on the 3rd day of his testimony, standing before an assembly that had grown from curious to horrified to something quieter and harder to name. 1,000 species slowly realizing that the species they had welcomed with open arms had never once in its recorded history been offered the luxury of open arms in return. "We call it the Ledger Century," Ellis said, and behind him, a holographic display rendered images the Compact's own archives had never needed to record. Ration books with names crossed out in trembling ink, bunkers built beneath cities that no longer existed, children taught to recognize the difference between a supply ship's engine hum and a warship's by the age of 6. "This is my grandmother's ration book," he continued, and the image sharpened. Pages yellowed and soft from handling. 3 names struck through in the same unsteady hand. She crossed out her sister's name, then her mother's, then, 6 months later, her own daughter's, my aunt, who did not survive the winter of the second collapse. She kept this book for 60 years after the war ended. She said crossing out a name was the only funeral some of them ever got. No one in the chamber spoke. Species that had never buried more than they could properly mourn sat in a silence that finally truly matched the weight of what they were hearing. "You ask why silence terrifies us," Ellis said. "I will tell you the honest answer, and I will not soften it for your comfort, because I think you have earned better than comfort from us. Silence, in our history, was never neutral. Silence was a sound made by a supply convoy 3 hours before it turned out to be a raiding fleet. Silence was what came over the emergency channels in the last minutes of a city about to be glassed. We did not learn to fear silence because we are cruel. We learned to fear it because it was, again and again, across 3 separate near extinctions, the last thing we heard before catastrophe. Senator Oro rose from its seat, storm-gray eyes fixed on Ellis with an intensity that had abandoned judgment entirely. 3 extinctions, it repeated softly, as though testing whether the words could possibly be true. Your species nearly ended 3 times, and still you cross a void between galaxies to find us? We didn't come because we were confident, Senator, Ellis said. We came because after everything, we still wanted to believe peace was possible somewhere. We just forgot how to recognize it when it finally arrived. Captain Voss did not fire because she is a monster. She fired because in 11 years of preparing for this journey, no one ever taught her what safety actually looks like. We taught her to survive. We never got the chance to teach her to trust. Across the chamber, murmurs shifted in tone, not toward forgiveness exactly, but toward something the compact had rarely needed before, the difficult, uncomfortable work of understanding atrocity without excusing it. Not every delegate softened. In the outer rings of the assembly, a block of representatives sat unmoved through every hour of testimony, a faction known as the Choir, ancient even by compact standards, whose founding purpose had been to preserve the 11,000-year peace at any cost necessary. Their speaker, a severe, crystalline being named Vesek, rose when Ellis finished, its voice carrying none of Oro's warmth. A moving account, Vesek said, each word precise as a blade. But an account of trauma is not an account of safety. You have told us a wounded species built weapons to survive its wounds. You have not told us those weapons will ever stop firing. 41 crews are dead because a soldier's instincts outran her judgment by 4 seconds. What happens the next time humanity's instincts are given the chance? Ellis had no answer that would satisfy a mind already made up. He looked to Oro instead, hoping for support, and found only the same storm-gray sorrow, offering no argument against Vesek's logic because there was, in truth, no argument that could fully disprove it. We are asking you to let us prove it will be different, Ellis said finally. Not because we deserve the benefit of the doubt. We don't, but because the alternative is deciding right now that trauma makes forgiveness impossible, and I refuse to believe 11,000 years of peace taught you that lesson. Vesek's crystalline features did not soften. Then let us hope, Ellis Cole, that your species learns faster than history usually allows. That night, in chambers sealed from human translators, the Choir convened to vote the rest of the compact would not learn of until it was already too late to stop. Vesek stood before its own faction, smaller than a full assembly, older, hardened by millennia spent as the compact's quiet conscience, and made an argument that Oro's mercy could never have anticipated. The assembly will forgive them, Vesek said. Compassion is the compact's oldest virtue, and its most dangerous. But compassion did not save the 41 crews who trusted a ceremony older than written history. Compassion will not save the next fleet, or the one after that, once humanity's instincts are triggered again by a threat that was never real. We were not created to punish. We were created to prevent tragedies the rest of the compact is too gentle to see coming. The vote was not close. In the sealed chambers of the Choir, a decision was made that no hearing, no testimony, no ration book full of crossed-out names could undo. Humanity was not evil. The Choir agreed. It was simply too dangerous to be allowed to remain. Ellis Cole slept that night for the first time in a week, cautiously hopeful that the truth had finally begun to build a bridge between 2 galaxies. He did not know that somewhere beyond the assembly's light, a faction of the very peace he had just tried to earn was already plotting the next atrocity, one that would prove, in the cruelest way imaginable, that fear was not a flaw unique to humanity at all. It was simply a language every civilization eventually learned to speak. 3 weeks after the hearing, the human colony convoy Halcyon Rise crossed into compact space carrying 2,000 civilians. Families, teachers, the first wave of humanity's tentative attempt to build something permanent in a galaxy that had almost destroyed itself deciding whether to trust them. They were unarmed. They had been escorted by treaty under a compact banner of safe passage. They believed, for the first time in 11 years, that they were finally truly safe. The Choir struck at dawn ship time in silence, the same sacred silence the compact had once offered humanity as a gift, now turned into the very weapon humanity had always feared it could become. There was no ceremony this time, no formation meant to honor anyone. Vesek's fleet emerged from the dark with weapons already live, and the Halcyon Rise, built for colonists, not soldiers, had no chance to run the terrible arithmetic Voss had run 3 weeks earlier. There was no 6 minutes of doubt. There was only annihilation, fast and total, delivered by a faction that believed, with total sincerity, that it was saving the galaxy from a danger too new to fully understand. When the distress signal finally reached the Marrow, it carried only 11 seconds of audio before the channel went permanently silent. Ellis was the one who heard it first. A mother's voice, cut short, calling a child's name into a comm channel that would never carry an answer back. He had spent weeks building a bridge between two galaxies out of ration books and testimony and Oro's storm-gray patience. He listened to that 11 seconds of audio 4 times before he could make himself walk to the bridge and tell Captain Voss what had happened. He did not need to explain it twice. Voss received the news the way she had received every catastrophe of her life, without visible reaction, a stillness that Ellis had learned, over 11 years, was far more dangerous than screaming would have been. She stood at the center of the bridge exactly as she had stood 3 weeks earlier, and this time there was no ambiguity to weigh. No 6 minutes of doubt to survive. There was only a colony convoy of families, dead in the silence the compact itself had taught humanity to fear. "Senator Oro," Voss said into the open channel, her voice flat and terrible, "confirm for me that this was not another misunderstanding." Oro's answer arrived heavy with a grief the compact had not needed to carry in 11,000 years. "It was not," Oro said. "It was the choir. They believe they acted to protect the peace. I am ashamed to tell you that a faction within my own civilization has done to you exactly what we accuse you of doing to us." Something shifted in Nora Voss in the silence that followed Oro's confession. Not rage, though rage was there, banked beneath the surface like coals waiting for wind. It was older than rage. It was the same cold, absolute clarity that had once organized a starving generation into rationing systems and resistant cells, and, eventually, a ship capable of crossing the void between galaxies. It was the instinct that had kept humanity alive through 3 extinctions, and it did not ask permission before it woke. "Ellis," she said, "how many ships does the choir have?" "Nora, how many?" He told her. It was, by any compact standard, an overwhelming force, a fleet the choir had maintained for 11,000 years specifically to prevent threats exactly like the one they now believed humanity to be, by human standards. After everything the Marrow's crew had survived to reach this galaxy, it was simply the next war in a line of wars they had never once been allowed to stop fighting. "Then we even the numbers," Voss said, and this time no one on the bridge hesitated to follow the order. Reyes's hands moved to the tactical console with the same train speed that had ended 41 lives 3 weeks earlier, except this time there was no ambiguity, no 6 minutes of doubt, only a colony convoy full of crossed-out names waiting to be avenged. Oro tried, one last time, to offer another path. "Captain Voss, please," let the assembly respond. "Let justice come from the compact, not from grief." "Senator," Voss said quietly, "we have been waiting 1100 years for someone else's justice to arrive in time. It never has. Not once. What followed was not a battle. It was a reckoning, fast and total in a way that stunned even the humans who executed it. A campaign built on 11 years of training, 1100 years of desperate survival instinct, and a grief too large to be contained by anything as narrow as strategy. The Marrow, reinforced by human colony defense ships that had followed the Halcyon Rise into compact space, engaged the choir's fleet across 6 systems in 4 days, and by the time the guns fell silent for the second time a month, the choir's military power no longer existed. It was, by every measure Voss had ever been trained to value, an overwhelming victory. It did not feel like one. Ellis walked the corridors of the Marrow afterward and found Reyes sitting alone near the tactical console, hands still trembling from days of combat, staring at a status board that confirmed, in cold green text, exactly how many ships humanity had just destroyed in the name of 2,000 civilians who could never be brought back. Voss stood at the observation deck for hours, watching wreckage drift where a fleet had once existed, and for the first time since the second collapse, she allowed herself to wonder whether victory and survival had quietly, somewhere along the way, become 2 entirely different things. Oro found her there, storm-gray eyes heavy with a grief that belonged equally to both galaxies now. You have proven the choir right and wrong in the same breath. Oro said softly. Wrong, because you were never simply a danger to be prevented. Right, because you have shown us, at last, exactly what that danger becomes when it is finally allowed to answer for itself. Va said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the certainty it had carried in the war room days earlier, only the exhausted, aching honesty of a soldier who had won and still felt, somehow, as though something essential had been lost in the winning. I don't know if we did the right thing, she said. I only know we did the thing we were built to do. I'm not sure anymore if that's the same thing. Peace, when it finally came, did not arrive as a celebration. It arrived the way most true endings do. Quietly, unevenly, full of grief that refused to resolve itself into anything as clean as relief. 6 months after the destruction of the choir's fleet, the Compact Assembly convened one final time, not to judge humanity, but to decide, together with a species that had crossed the void between galaxies carrying scars no one else could fully understand, what the future between two peoples might actually look like. Ellis Cole stood before the Assembly one last time, older in the eyes if nowhere else, and did not need to explain the Ledger Century again. Everyone in that chamber had lived through their own version of it now. The Compact through the choir's betrayal, humanity through a second tragedy it had never wanted to survive. They no longer needed translation to understand each other's grief. They had built the vocabulary themselves, in wreckage and testimony, and 6 devastating months neither side would ever fully recover from. We are not asking to be forgiven, Ellis said. We are asking to be understood. There's a difference, and I think, now, you finally know what it is. The document the Assembly drafted took 11 weeks to finalize. Fitting, Ellis thought privately, for a species whose entire history seemed to orbit the number. It was not a treaty of alliance in the traditional sense. It made no promises that humanity's instincts would never again misfire under pressure. No guarantee that trauma 11 centuries deep could be undone by 6 months of grief shared across the stars. Instead, it did something the Compact had never needed to do before in 11,000 years of peaceful contact. It built provisions for misunderstanding itself, protocols for silence, for ceremony, for the careful, deliberate translation not just of language but of fear. Senator Oro presented the final clause personally, storm gray eyes steady on Ellis as it spoke. The Compact recognizes that humanity's reactions, however severe, are not born of malice, but survival earned at a cost no species should have to pay. We do not ask you to become what you are not. We ask only that we learn together how to build safety where none has ever existed before. Vesek was not present for the signing. What remained of the choir had quietly dissolved in the aftermath of its own catastrophic misjudgment, its surviving members scattered among assembly factions that no longer trusted certainty as much as they once had. It was, Ellis thought, its own kind of justice, not punishment, but the slow, humbling work of an ancient civilization learning that even 11,000 years of peace could not fully protect against the failures of good intentions. After the signing, Ellis found Oro alone on an observation deck overlooking the wreckage field the Compact had chosen. Deliberately, never to fully clear, a memorial, Oro explained, to the 41 ships and the Halcyon Rise alike, a reminder that peace was not the absence of tragedy, but the decision to keep choosing it anyway. Do you regret it? Oro asked, coming here, finding us, everything that followed. Ellis considered the question longer than he expected to. I regret that it took a massacre for either of us to understand each other, he said finally. I don't regret trying. My grandmother used to say that hope was the last ration that never ran out, no matter how bad things got. I think that's why we came. Not because we were confident, because we were hoping, even after everything, that somewhere out here, safety was still possible. Oro was quiet for a long moment, watching the drifting wreckage catch the light of a star that had witnessed both tragedies without ever once intervening. Fear does not disappear because peace has been signed, it said finally. I think perhaps that is true for us as much as for you now. We believe ourselves safe for 11,000 years. We have learned this year exactly how fragile that belief always was. So what do we do with that? Ellis asked. The same thing your species has always done, Oro said, something almost like warmth returning to its shifting eyes. We survive it, together this time instead of alone. Years later, Long after the treaty had aged into something closer to friendship than diplomacy, long after Captain Nora Voss had finally, quietly, allowed herself to sleep through a full night for the first time since childhood, Ellis Cole sat alone on the bridge of the Marrow, running his fingers over a small brown stain on the edge of his old console. Coffee, spilled in the first frantic seconds of the battle that had started everything, dried into the metal so completely that no amount of cleaning had ever fully removed it. He had asked once whether it should be replaced. The engineers had offered. He had said no. Some scars, he had come to understand, were not meant to be erased. Not because anyone wanted them there, but because they told the truth about where a person or a people had been. Humanity had not arrived in this galaxy as monsters, and it had not left it as saints. It had arrived simply as survivors, carrying wounds no gentler history could have prepared to set down, learning slowly, imperfectly, alongside a civilization that had needed, at terrible cost, to learn some of those same lessons for the first time. The coffee stain remained on the console, small and stubborn and permanent, exactly the way the memory of 41 ships and 2,000 civilians remained in the quiet places of everyone who had survived to build something better out of the wreckage. Not because anyone wanted it there, but because it told the truth about where they had been, and because Ellis had finally learned that truth was not something to erase, but something to carry forward, gently, into whatever peace came next.